My name is Robin. It was just another sweltering summer day, the kind where you feel the sun drilling into your back even through your shirt. I'd been on shift since 5 in the morning, 3 serious calls before noon, and I was looking forward to clocking out. Then, my damn car decided to throw a tantrum right on Highway 51. Hood up and cursing under my breath, I glanced around, hoping for a miracle or at least a tow truck. That's when he pulled over. I didn't know it then, but Jake was going to change my life. Need some help, he called out, sauntering over with a grin that could knock you off your feet. He wore a simple tee and jeans, but carried himself like he owned the place. Yeah, thanks. It just died on me, I said, trying to keep my cool despite the heat. Jake nodded, his hands already diving under the hood. Let's see what you've got here. Your battery's connection's loose. Happens a lot in this heat. There you go, should be good now. I tried the ignition, and the engine roared back to life, a relief washing over me. Thank you. I thought I was going to be stuck here forever. No problem at all. It's too hot to leave someone stranded. You a nurse? He asked, nodding towards my uniform. Paramedic, I corrected him with a smile. Long shifts, lots of adrenaline, and not enough coffee. Jake laughed, a sound that filled the space between us comfortably. Sounds tough. I work construction, mostly on government buildings. So I get the long hours too. We chatted a bit more by the side of the road. It was one of those easy conversations that you don't expect to have with a complete stranger. Before we parted ways, Jake said, Robin, maybe I can take you out for coffee sometime? You can tell me more about being a paramedic, and I can bore you with stories about electrical codes. I found myself nodding before I even thought it through. I'd like that. We exchanged numbers, and as he drove away, I couldn't help the silly grin spreading across my face. Coffee turned into dinner, and dinner turned into late-night talks and walks along the river. Jake had a rough charm about him, a straightforward way of talking that made you listen. He didn't sugarcoat his words, didn't dress them up. And I liked that about him. We'd meet up whenever my shifts and his job sites allowed. It wasn't easy, both of us working odd hours, but it felt right whenever we found time together. A couple of months in, during a quiet moment overlooking the city lights from the park hill, Jake pulled a small box from his jacket. Robin, I ain't good with fancy speeches, he said, his voice rough like always. But I know a good thing when I see it, and I don't want to let go. Marry me? It was blunt, unexpected, and so very Jake. I said yes without a second thought. We didn't plan a big event, neither of us cared for that kind of show. Just a simple ceremony at the town hall with a few friends and his mom, who took to calling me daughter from day one. Settling into Jake's family home wasn't the honeymoon paradise some might expect, but it felt right, like I was finally where I belonged. The house was an old 2-story building with creaky floors and a cozy kind of clutter that made you feel at home the minute you walked in. The first morning I woke up there as Jake's wife felt surreal. I was nudged awake not by the blare of my alarm, but by the rich aroma of coffee brewing downstairs and the distant sound of Martha humming an old tune. I patted down, finding her in the kitchen, which was her kingdom, really. Morning, sunshine, Martha greeted without turning. Hope you like your coffee strong and your toast on the darker side. I wouldn't have it any other way, I replied, sliding onto a stool at the counter. This casual kitchen chatter became our morning ritual. It wasn't just about the breakfast, it was her way of checking in, making sure I was settling in okay without making a big fuss about it. Jake had already left for work, typical of his early starts. He tried to keep his construction gigs close to home, but some days he'd be gone before dawn and not back till everyone else was turning in. It put a strain on us, sure, but we made it work. One evening, about a week after the wedding, I was folding laundry in the living room when Martha sat down across from me, her expression more serious than usual. You know, Robin, Jake's father was just like him when we were young. Always working, always making sure we had enough. Hard shoes to fill, but he's doing his best, she said, smoothing out a shirt I had just folded. I know he is. And I love him for it, I replied, catching her eye. It's not easy, but what's the point if it's not a bit of a challenge, right? Martha chuckled. That's the spirit. Just remember, this house is as much yours now as it is ours. Don't ever feel like you can't make your mark here. That meant the world to me. It wasn't long after that chat that I found out I was pregnant. The joy on Jake's face when I told him was something I'd freeze in time if I could. We were going to be parents, and suddenly, the house felt too small for all the love it had to hold. During those months, Martha taught me everything, from baby-proofing the house to managing night feeds. Her support was unwavering. The day our son was born, she was right there, handing me water, wiping my brow, and whispering words of encouragement. Bringing our son home was another chapter. I quit my job to stay home with him, thinking it'd be a breeze with all the stories and advice I had armed myself with. But nothing ever really prepares you for motherhood, does it? The sleepless nights, the constant worry, you name it, I felt it. After months of being at home with my son, I started feeling the walls close in on me. I loved my boy to bits, don't get me wrong, but there was a part of me that missed the rush of the ambulance, the urgency of saving lives, and the camaraderie with my team. I remember broaching the topic with Jake one evening after dinner. He was wiping down the table, a furrow between his brows like he always had when deep in thought or stress. Jake, I've been thinking about going back to work, just a couple of shifts a week, I said, watching his reaction closely. He paused, the cloth in his hand stopping mid-swipe. Work, huh? And what about the little guy? Who's gonna watch him? We could look into daycare, or maybe your mom could watch him, I suggested, trying to sound casual, though my stomach was tight with nerves. Jake sighed, tossing the cloth onto the counter with more force than necessary. Daycare? That's not happening. My boy isn't going to be raised by strangers. And mom's already doing enough around here. The conversation quickly turned tense. It's not about not wanting to be with our son. You know I love him. But I need something for myself too, Jake. I need to feel like I'm more than just a mom. Jake ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated. And what about what I need? I need you here. We agreed on this, remember? When we decided to have a kid? I remembered, all right. But back then, I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd lose in the process. Things change, Jake. I didn't know I'd feel this way. He didn't respond right away, just stared out the window at the darkening yard. Finally, he muttered, Fine, Robin, do what you gotta do. But we're not doing daycare. Thankfully, Martha stepped in, bless her heart. I'll watch him, she declared one morning, having overheard one of our discussions. You go back to work. It'll do you good. With that settled, I started back part-time. The first day pulling on my uniform again felt like slipping back into my old skin. But the balancing act was harder than I'd anticipated. Work was demanding, and home was equally taxing. Jake's job took him away often, and when he was home, he was increasingly critical. You're never here anymore, he'd say, or, why is the house always a mess? The comment stung, especially when I was stretching myself thin trying to keep everyone happy. One night, standing over the sink scrubbing at a stubborn pot, I finally snapped. I can't do everything, Jake. I'm working, taking care of our son, trying to keep up with the house. What do you want from me? We glared at each other, the air thick between us. Then, without another word, Jake grabbed his coat and left, the door slamming shut behind him. The sound echoed, much like the gap growing between us. One cold evening, after a particularly grueling day, I found Jake sitting at the kitchen table, paper strewn about, his face buried in his hands. He didn't hear me come in. Long day? I asked, setting down my paramedic bag a little harder than necessary. Jake looked up, his eyes tired and red. Yeah, the site's behind schedule, and the foreman's on my back about it. It's all a mess. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling the weight of my own day bearing down. Tell me about it. Had a kid, no older than ours, come in with a broken arm. The screams, just takes it out of you. Jake nodded but was silent. It was like he was there but not really. I missed him, missed us talking. The real test came when my mother-in-law's health took a turn for the worse. It was a Tuesday when I got the call from the clinic. They said she needed to come in for some tests. They'd found something during a routine checkup. Something serious. I was folding laundry when I told Jake. His reaction was nothing like I expected. A brain tumor? So, what are they gonna do about it? His voice was devoid of warmth, practical to a fault. They're not sure yet. More tests. Maybe surgery, I explained, trying to keep my own fear in check. And how are you planning to juggle that with everything else? He asked, his tone almost accusatory. I don't know, Jake. But she's your mother. We have to do something. I snapped back, frustration boiling over. Great, just great, he muttered, rubbing his temples. Just what we need, more complications. It felt like his empathy had evaporated when I needed him most. The following weeks were a blur of hospital visits, doctors' consultations, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy at home. Jake rarely came with me to see his mom. It was always, I've got to work, or I'm too tired tonight. One evening, after I'd spent several hours at the clinic, I came home to find Jake on the couch, watching TV. How's Mom? He asked without looking away from the screen. Not great. She might have to stay for observation, I said, dropping onto the couch beside him, exhausted. Jake sighed. Well, you're the medical expert, Robin. You handle it. His words felt like a slap. I am handling it, Jake. But she's your mother. Don't you think you should be a bit more involved? He turned then, his face hard and cold. Look, I've got enough on my plate. You wanted to go back to work, you deal with it. That night, we went to bed angry and distant. The gap between us grew each day, filled with unspoken resentments and exhaustion. I lay awake, listening to his steady breathing, wondering how we had gotten here, to this place where even compassion seemed too much to muster. The tumor was inoperable, and the decision to bring Martha home was filled with a mix of dread and determination. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, especially with everything else on my plate, but family is family. The house was filled with the constant, underlying scent of medicine that seemed to permeate everything. Jake seemed to shrink away more and more with each passing day. He barely looked at his mother, and when he did, his face twisted into a scowl that didn't sit right with me. Can't you open a window here? It smells like a hospital, Jake complained one evening as he walked through the living room, his nose wrinkled in disgust. It's the smell of her medication. She needs them, Jake. Try a little compassion, huh? I shot back, my patience wearing thin. His response was a grunt as he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. I'm going out. I can't deal with this tonight. And just like that, I was left alone again, to manage the household, care for our son, and now, nurse my ailing mother-in-law. During the day, while my son was at school and I wasn't working a shift, I spent hours with Martha, reading to her, managing her medications, and talking about old times. She had become more than a mother-in-law to me, she was a confidant, a friend. One afternoon, as I was adjusting her pillows, she took my hand and looked at me with those wise old eyes that seemed to see right through you. You have been my strength, Robin, she said softly. I'm sorry for how my son has turned out. He wasn't always like this. I squeezed her hand, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. It's not your fault, Martha. We all make our own choices. She smiled weakly. Still, I wish things were different. But I've got something planned for you. A little surprise. Just wait and see. Before I could ask her to explain, she drifted off to sleep, leaving me puzzled but grateful for her words. As her condition worsened, it became clear that she couldn't stay at home any longer. The day came to move her to a hospice, a place equipped to handle her needs round the clock. I remember packing a small bag of her things, her favorite blanket, and some books. Jake was conspicuously absent, his presence shrinking more with each day. At the hospice, I tried to make her room as homely as possible. My son, who had just turned 7, was with me. He was quiet, sensing the gravity of the situation, but not fully understanding it. When Martha woke and saw us, her face lit up, a stark contrast to the sterile white of her room. She motioned for my son to come closer and handed him a brand new phone. "Here, my boy. A gift for you. Think of me when you use it." My son was overjoyed, his small face breaking into a wide grin. "Thank you, Grandma." He hugged her gently, then sat beside her bed, setting it up. A month later, Martha died quietly in her room. It had been a week of sorrow, organizing a funeral that Jake couldn't bother to attend because of a so-called urgent business trip. Alone, I managed every detail and bore the cost of saying goodbye to the woman who had become more mother than mother-in-law. It was a small service, just a few close friends and relatives who knew her well. I stood there, holding our son's hand, feeling the weight of the absence of her own son. Late one night not long after, Jake stormed in. The noise of the door banging open jolted me awake. He wasn't alone. A woman was with him, her smirk as chilling as the night air that swept in with them. "This is Cheryl," he introduced without preamble, his words slurred and clumsy. "My fiancé. We're getting married as soon as you're out of the picture." I sat up, pulling the sheets around me, my mind racing. "What are you talking about, Jake? What do you mean?" He tossed a stack of papers onto the bed, divorce papers. "I want you out, Robin, tonight. I've waited long enough. Mom's gone, and there's no reason to pretend anymore." The room spun, my heart thudding painfully against my chest. "Out? Jake, where are we supposed to go? What about our son?" Jake glanced at Cheryl, who looked around our bedroom like she was already redecorating it in her mind. "He's your problem now. I'm done with both of you. Cheryl and we're starting fresh. We've got plans." I could barely speak, my voice a whisper of disbelief. "You want to throw out your own son? Your mother just..." "Enough about my mother." His voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. "She's gone, and good riddance. It made my life hell having her sick here." Cheryl laughed, a sound that was sharp and cruel. "Honey, let's not waste time here. She's not worth it." With trembling hands, I took the papers. Each page was a nail in the coffin of our marriage. I signed them, not fully processing the lines and clauses, a part of me still in disbelief. I got up, my movements robotic, and started gathering essentials, documents, some clothes for me and our son, the little savings I had stashed away. When I entered our son's room, he wasn't asleep. He sat up in bed, his new phone in hand, his eyes wide and scared. "Mom, I heard everything." Forcing a smile that hurt, I sat next to him, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "We've got to go, sweetheart. Just for a little while, until I figure things out." We left the house with just a few bags, stepping out into the cold night. I called a taxi, which took us to a nearby hotel. Lying in the hotel room, listening to my son breathe softly, sleep far from my eyes, I felt the first stir of something fierce and strong within me. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Not like this. Jake had made his choice, but now, it was time to make mine. I met the next morning at the hotel in a disassembled state. But life went on. As I was getting ready to take my son to school, he stopped me with a serious look I'd never seen on his face before. "Mom," he said, holding up his phone, "I recorded something last night. You need to see this." He played a video, and my heart sank as I listened to Jake's cruel words, not just to me, but about us. It was more than painful, it was evidence. After dropping my son off at school, I felt a mix of anger and determination as I drove to work. I called my friend Carol, who worked in HR at Jake's company. "Carol, I need you to see something," I said and explained briefly. I sent her the video. "Just watch it. It's important." She was quiet for a moment after the video ended. "This is serious, Robin," she finally said. "I'm so sorry, but we need to address this. I'll take it from here." Feeling a small sense of relief, I tried to focus on my work, but it was nearly impossible with everything hanging over me. Later that afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Mrs. Robin Thompson?" a formal voice asked. "Yes, it is," I replied. "My name is George Stanton. I was your mother-in-law's attorney." It's urgent that we meet to discuss her last wishes. Of course, I said, a lump forming in my throat. We arranged to meet within the hour. Mr. Stanton greeted me with a solemn nod and ushered me into his office, where he got straight to the point. Martha was very explicit in her will, he began, pushing a stack of papers across his desk towards me. She has left everything to you and your son, the house, her car, and a substantial amount of money. I was speechless, tears forming in my eyes as he handed me a letter from Martha. Her words thanked me for the love and care I'd shown her. You were the daughter I chose, she wrote. Overwhelmed, I wiped my eyes. Just then, the door burst open. Jake stormed in, Cheryl trailing behind him, her face twisted in anger at seeing me there. What's going on? Jake demanded. Mr. Stanton didn't miss a beat. Martha left the majority of her estate to her daughter-in-law and grandson, he explained calmly. You've been bequeathed the contents of the garage. Jake's face turned red, his anger palpable. This is nonsense. I'll contest this. Mr. Stanton politely replied, There's no money coming to you, sir. Everything was left to Mrs. Thompson. Any attempt to contest this will likely be futile and costly. Cheryl's interest visibly waned, she looked at Jake and then at the plain surroundings of the office. I'm not sticking around for this. I don't need a penniless lover, she muttered and walked out, her high heels clicking sharply on the floor. Jake looked as if he might explode. This isn't the end, he spat at me before turning and leaving, slamming the door behind him. As I left Mr. Stanton's office, the papers clutched in my hand felt like a shield. Martha's final gift had given me more than just material security, it gave me a measure of justice, and for the first time in a long while, a genuine hope for the future. I never thought I'd find myself in a courtroom arguing for a divorce I didn't initially want, but life has a funny way of throwing you curveballs. Jake had done a complete 180 when he realized what he stood to lose, not just me and our son, but the comfortable life in the house and the wealth left by his mother. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was stiff and formal, a stark contrast to the chaos of my emotions. Jake was there, looking worn but determined, a sharp-dressed lawyer by his side. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up, his voice shaky. I've made mistakes, big ones, and I'm sorry. I don't want to lose my family. I want to make things right with my wife and son, he pleaded, his eyes darting around the room but mostly avoiding mine. I listened, feeling a mix of pity and anger. When it was my turn, my lawyer handed me the phone. Your Honor, I wish things could be different. But I believe this video will show why that's not possible, I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. The judge watched the video, his expression growing tighter with each passing second. When it ended, he looked over at Jake, his face hard with barely concealed contempt. This court sees no reason to deny the petition for divorce. It's clear that the relationship has suffered irreparably. In the weeks that followed, the fallout for Jake was worse than I expected. The video not only secured my divorce, but also rippled through his life like a shockwave. Carol, my friend from HR, had made sure the right people saw his behavior. Jake's company transferred him to another branch, a demotion in all but name, and slashed his salary. Cheryl, the assistant manager and the woman he'd left me for, was fired for her misconduct and fined heavily by the company. Life at home started to settle into a new normal. I went back to work as a paramedic, something that grounded me and gave me purpose beyond the courtroom and the drama. One evening, after a particularly tough shift, my son and I sat on the porch of our big, beautiful house, the house Martha left us. He was doing his homework, and I was sipping on a well-deserved cup of tea, watching the sunset. Mom, are you okay? He asked, looking up from his books with those thoughtful eyes so much like his grandmother's. I am, baby. Better than okay, I answered, smiling. We've got each other, and we've got a home. That's more than enough. He smiled, went back to his homework, and I turned my face back to the fading light. The evening was peaceful, the kind of peace that comes after a storm, when everything is washed clean, and the world looks fresh and bright.